This presentation is entitled Bilingualism and the Global Nomad Family, and what I intend to do in this seminar is to help families make decisions about how language fits into their mobile lifestyle and how to make it work for their kids and for their family. On this slide you can see there's a picture of some Dutch cheese, which is an integral part of every child's childhood in the Netherlands. At the top in Dutch it says plakje kaas, which means piece of cheese. When I first moved to the Netherlands, my daughter was very young, and I remember going into a cheese shop with her when she was about 18 months old, and we were with another group of friends who had kids the same age. I learned some Dutch quite early on, and the cheese shop woman always spoke to me in Dutch, and so she took my cheese order, and then she said to my daughter in Dutch, plakje kaas. And Maddie said, alsjeblieft, and got her piece of cheese. Then she turned to help the English speakers in our group. She served them in English, and she didn't offer their kids a piece of cheese, which they were naturally quite upset about. And so it really started me thinking about how much our choices as adults impact our children in ways that we don't necessarily consider. And when we choose to live in an environment where we are not of that culture, we need to consider carefully what it looks like from our children's perspective. As adults moving to the Netherlands, if we're going to be here for 2 or 3 years, it makes sense to not learn Dutch. Everybody speaks English, we're not going to be here very long. But to a very small child who can't integrate in their world or understand why they can't integrate in their world, it makes things a lot more difficult. And so what I'd like to address today is how to make the decision for whether or not you want to choose for a new language, and how to choose against a new language with empathy and with understanding for your children, and also how to take languages with you when you leave. So there are 3 paths that you can choose when moving to a new country. The first thing you can choose for is for bilingualism for your children. If you think you're going to be there for a while, if your children only speak one language, it's an excellent choice to decide to have your children learn the local language. You need to learn how to do it properly, and you need to learn to understand what are the best practice elements of how to make that decision. The second choice you might make is you might choose against bilingualism. You might think that you're not going to be there for long enough, your children may have enough languages to deal with, your children may have special educational needs, they may be too old. There are a lot of reasons why you would choose against the local language, but there are ways to do it properly. And the final element is, of course, taking bilingualism with you. If you are a family that has more than one language in your environment, either in your family or outside your family, you need to plan for how you're going to maintain those languages for your children everywhere you go. So the first point I'd like to address is reasons for choosing bilingualism for your children. If you arrive in a new country and you have children who only speak one language, what are good reasons for deciding to have them learn the local language? There are lots of really, really good reasons to choose bilingualism for your children. The first set of reasons are what we call linguistic reasons. The most obvious of these is that learning a second language means they have more than one language to speak. There are also other linguistic benefits to learning languages at a young age. So, for example, when a child is very young, they can hear and produce all of the sounds that are natural to the human vocal tract. As we age, our brains start to specialize in the sounds that are native to our mother tongue. And so if we only speak one language, by the time we're adults, the sounds that we can hear and produce are limited to that one language. If we speak more than one language, we have a wider phonetic repertoire to build on, and there's also a lot of evidence that it keeps our phonetic flexibility at a higher level, so we are better at learning other languages later in life as well. The second set of reasons are cognitive reasons. There's a lot of evidence from research that children who are bilingual from a very young age can have some cognitive benefits in terms of how they perform in other areas as well. The most interesting and unusual cognitive benefit is that bilingual children are generally better in mathematics than monolingual children from an early age up until about the age of 11. This doesn't mean that they're always going to be better than monolingual children, but it does mean that they have some early advantages that come from the fact that their brain has learned to process 2 languages and has acquired abstract thought at a younger age. The third and very important category is social reasons for choosing for bilingualism. When we have young children who are in an environment where they don't speak the language, They don't have any understanding of why they cannot communicate with those around them. And if there's only one language in our family, there's no real reason to not allow them the chance to acquire that other language, so that they can communicate with the kids in the park, so that they communicate with the kids on the street, and so that they can feel a part of the society they live in. It's very interesting to watch in parks in multilingual areas the social interaction between different groups of children and what languages they speak. And I've seen on more than one occasion a group of children identifying a child who doesn't speak their language and choosing, for example, to take their shovel from the sand pit because they can't ask for it back. It doesn't happen all the time like that, of course, but it is a basic need of children to interact with other kids their age and to be able to play and communicate their needs. And it means that they will feel more comfortable in their environment and more able to pursue their childlike interests. So what are the necessary conditions for choosing bilingualism for your children? What are the factors that would mean that it's a good idea versus a bad idea? When you're making the choice to choose for a local language or against a local language, these are the factors you need to consider. The first one is how long you're planning to stay. If you're only staying for 6 months, then of course your child won't have very much time to learn the language, and it may not be worth the effort they'd have to make. If you're going to stay for 10 years, I would argue that it's imperative that your children learn the local language, because that location is going to be a big part of their life. How long the stay needs to be for the language acquisition process to happen depends on the age of the children. A general benchmark is that the younger the child is, the shorter the time period to make it worthwhile, and the older the child, the longer the time period to make it worthwhile. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, younger children are generally less self-conscious about being in an environment where they don't understand the language, and more likely to pick it up quickly. So if you have a 2-year-old and you're planning on staying for somewhere for 2 years, it's an excellent idea to put them in daycare in the local language, and they will pick up some of the local language and they will learn to communicate. If you have a school-age child, for example, a 7-year-old, and you're planning on staying for 2 years, chances are that that's not long enough for the child to feel comfortable in the language and to learn well in that language, so then you would choose against. So you need to look at your family circumstances, you need to look at the ages of your children and how long you might stay when making that decision. You also need to consider how frequently in your life you'll move. If you're a mobile family that moves every 2 to 3 years, you obviously can't drop your kids into the new local language everywhere you go. It wouldn't be beneficial for them. So when you're doing your life plan and estimating how many times you'll move, you need to look carefully at how many languages you can integrate successfully. After looking at all of those basic elements, you also need to look at your individual child. There is a myth that all children learn language easily and that they're little sponges, and from the outside it does seem that way, but acquiring a new language is also a lot of work for a child, and it can also be difficult socially when they can't communicate. So you need to look at your individual child and decide if you think that they have the personality that it takes to go into a new school at the age of 5 and learn the language and integrate. Or if they have the motivation. If they really want to do it, then they'll probably be fine. But if they think it's a terrible idea, they probably won't. As children get older, aptitude also comes into it. Some children are better language learners than others, and you need to look at your individual child and decide if you think that they're a fantastic language learner, will enjoy the activity, and will do well at it, then it's a fine choice. But if your child has struggled already with language, it may not be the right choice. Again, you have to look at the other languages already in your family. If you're a bilingual family, you need to choose more carefully adding in other languages, because you don't want it to be to the detriment of the languages they already speak. So we are a French and English bilingual family. We've added Dutch in for our children because they can handle 3, but we probably would not choose for another language until they are older, because we want to ensure that they speak those 3 languages properly. And finally, you need to look at any special circumstances your child may have. If your child is a monolingual child and already has a speech or language delay, it may not be a good idea to introduce another language if it's not necessary. If it is necessary, it can be done and they can become bilingual, but you have to weigh the benefit against the risk and the effort from the child. So these are the factors you need to look into when deciding for or against bilingualism. So, if you decide that bilingualism or adding in the local language is not the right choice for your child or children, how do you proceed to live in your environment in an empathetic way? I see in my practice quite often families who move to different places and who don't learn the local language, which I think is a perfectly fine decision depending on your circumstances. However, I believe that if you choose to not learn the local language and to not have the children learn the local language, you need to have an ongoing discussion with your children about your reasons. In a post-colonial age, what we are doing now is creating a new generation of neo-colonials who move around the globe and only speak their own language. And so if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that they are doing it in a manner that is empathetic to the local populations. So the first thing you need to do is help your children understand language use and language choice. So what is the language used in our host country at the moment, and why are we choosing to use our language instead of their language, and how it reflects or doesn't reflect on your views about language status. As monolinguals or bilingual families living outside our language environments, when we speak to our children, the language choice that we make carries with it a host of messages about how we feel about our language group and how we feel about the other language group and how we feel about people who speak our language and how we feel about people who don't speak our language and how we feel about people who speak the language we don't speak. There are a lot of messages underlying what comes out of our mouth with our children, and so we need to address them. For example, if we go back to my original example of being in the cheese shop, the little English children with us did not understand why they weren't offered a piece of cheese. The parents understood that it's a transaction that happens mostly in Dutch, and therefore if I speak in Dutch to the woman who's selling me the cheese, I'll get a piece of cheese, and if I speak in English to her, I won't. But from the perspective of a 2-year-old child, it just looks like favoritism. That kid got a piece of cheese and I didn't get a piece of cheese. So we need to have a discussion with our children about the fact that, for example, we live in the Netherlands and everybody speaks Dutch. We haven't learned any Dutch because we're not here very long, and so we have to ask them to speak to us in English. And they're very nice to speak to us in English, but they don't usually offer a piece of cheese because that's something they do in Dutch. And just by putting ourselves down to the level of our children, explaining what the transaction was from a linguistic perspective, it helps them understand the consequences of language choice decisions. Another thing that we need to make very careful of is that we're a positive model of language status. When we're living in a country where we don't speak the language, especially if we're English speakers, there's always a danger of being a part of a high status language group versus a low status language group. And we need to be very careful about not transmitting that to our children, that as English speakers we can go anywhere and use English and speak whatever we want, and we don't have to worry about whatever the local language is. And so it's important to always mention to our children the fact that in the country we're living in, this is the most important language, but because we don't speak it, we will use something else. What that will do is it will help your children bring home positive attitudes of the places that they've lived. If you do go home, they will remember, rather than remembering, oh, those people didn't speak our language, they'll remember, oh, those people spoke another language, but they were nice enough to use our language with us. And so all of the things that happen outside the house in an environment where we choose against bilingualism for our family or our children are really important teaching moments in terms of helping our children be culturally sensitive and grow up being good third culture kids. The last point I'd like to talk about is the idea of taking language with you. Some of us are bilingual families, and everywhere we go we already have 2 languages to take. If you move to a new country and you decide to have your children learn another language, then you also have another language to take with you. Generally speaking, it's not a good idea to pick up and drop languages as you move around the globe for a variety of reasons. And so when choosing to add in an extra language, if it's a home language or an outside language, you need to plan ahead for how that language will move with you. So for example, if you're a bilingual family, or a monolingual family who speaks a minority language and you're moving to a new place, you need to consider how are you going to maintain your children's language use in your new home. For those of us who are English speakers, generally speaking, there are English schools available wherever we go that will help us maintain English for our children. For people who have other languages in their home, it's not always as easy to choose for school in that language. So if you have a home language that you're going to take with you on your travels, you need to plan for several steps of maintenance for your children. If you're taking very young children, you need to plan for how their language will grow to maturity. You need to plan for how they will become literate and able to read and write in that language. And you need to plan ahead to where you think they might want to go to school and what language they may want to use. Because it's very important to consider your child's entire academic career when making your language decisions. Because if you don't plan for it carefully, they may end up, after secondary school, not mastering to a high enough level the language that you thought they would go to university in. And so you need to make sure you plan carefully all the different steps of language growth for your children. If you decide to bring with you a new language, for example, if you've moved to the Netherlands and your kids have learned Dutch and then you decide to move back home to your country, you need to plan for how you're going to take Dutch home with you. Some families choose to have their children immersed in Dutch and to learn Dutch to a reasonable level, and then when they go home they just let Dutch go. This is a fine decision to make if you're moving to a place, for example, where it's very hard to maintain Dutch. I've worked with several families who are Australian, whose kids learn Dutch here, and in Australia it's very, very difficult to maintain Dutch to any reasonable level. So they look at it as it was a great experience for their kids, but probably they are never going to maintain Dutch into adulthood. If your children have learned a new language that you do wish to take with you, again, you need to plan for how that will happen. When you move away from the environment, you need to think about where are your children going to hear the language. Are you going to bring in babysitters who speak that language? Are you going to maintain friendships with people from the country? What are the different resources you're going to take with you in terms of books, in terms of DVDs, in terms of favorite TV shows that will help your children keep up their exposure to the language and keep up the necessity to use it? And so once again, the important word is planning. You have to plan for taking a language with you. So whether you're bringing a language on your travels or whether you're picking up a new language on your travels and want to maintain it, it's very, very important that you consider all the factors that go into language growth and maintenance for children. If your child learns Dutch between the ages of 2 and 5 and then you leave the Netherlands and essentially don't use Dutch again, your child will lose that Dutch. The general benchmark for language maintenance is literacy. If a child can read and write in a language, they have the chance to maintain it as a lifelong language if they choose. If they can't read and write, it can very easily become a lost language. So again, think carefully about what you're choosing and what are your long-term prospects and make your plans in accordance. So the last issue that I'd like to address is that things don't always go smoothly on our journeys around the world with other languages, and it's important to know when to get help for our child or for our family. If you believe that your children are having a problem with the local language or that you are having a problem with the local language, don't be afraid to find the appropriate professionals who can help you with this. A first type of professional who can help you is your relocation specialist. If your company has assigned you a relocation specialist or a relocation company, they should be the first person that you contact in terms of finding extra resources. They can often help with school choices or with finding somebody who can help you with school choices. They can often help with finding tutors for languages if necessary, or other specialist services. If you've chosen for bilingualism for your children and you're concerned about their progress, you may want to bring on board a speech therapist or an educational specialist. The bilingualism journey isn't always smooth for all children, and neither is the monolingualism journey, actually. And so if you are concerned, the first thing to do is to have an appropriate evaluation to find out if your concern is well placed or if it's simply just your child adjusting to a new language. And finally, it's often important to bring in somebody who's a bilingual specialist who understands the issues that bilingual families face or nomad families face and can help you look at your family language situation and make sure that all of the elements are in place for successful bilingualism for your children. So to wrap up this mini seminar, I think there are 3 important points to take away from it. First of all, it's important to remember that language use and language issues are an important part of a global nomad lifestyle, and they need to always be considered. Many global nomads move around the world 6, 7, 8 postings while their children are small, and you have to consider all the different languages that they are exposed to and how that affects them and how it affects your lifestyle. Language is an integral part of the third culture kid experience, whether you choose for or against the local language. Children who are exposed to the local language also are obviously exposed to a deeper aspect of the local culture, but even children who are not integrated into the local language and the local culture still live very much in a global environment or in an environment that isn't of themselves and of their own language. And so it's important not to neglect the fact that language and their language choices and their language experiences on the journey will in part shape their views as an adult about language and language use, their own languages and other languages. And it's also important, of course, not to neglect that language is a part of the adult expat experience as well. So as you're planning your own journeys, consider the impact for you of moving to a country where you don't speak the language and need to learn it versus the impact of moving to a country where you don't speak the language but you don't need to learn it, and how it will feel for you as an expat adult to live in a culture where you don't speak the language versus where you do. Many times we're focused on the minutiae of moving our families around, about finding a house and finding a school and finding a babysitter and finding a gym, and we neglect to think about the fact that we're going to be doing all of those either in another language or in our own language with the understanding we're asking somebody else to speak a language that is not their own. And so for the whole family, it's important to remember that language use and language choice are important elements of an expat lifestyle.